Greenland is a vast island at the edge of the North Atlantic. Its coastline is irregular. Fjords cut deep into the land. Peninsulas extend into the sea. Glaciers flow down from the interior. The interior is covered by ice, a massive ice sheet that has existed for thousands of years. The climate is cold. Winter brings long periods of darkness. Summer days are brief but bright. The warmth is limited. Around the end of the 10th century, Norse settlers arrived on Greenland. They came from Iceland. They traveled by sea. They navigated fjords and glaciers to find land they could inhabit. This is the story of those settlements, how they were established, how people lived, how they adapted to one of the harshest environments in the North Atlantic. The account is based on archaeological evidence, on historical records, on environmental data. It is not a tale of adventure, it is a record of daily life, of farming, hunting, and survival, of communities that endured for centuries. We begin with the arrival of the Norse, with the landscape they encountered, with the choices they made. The first recorded expedition to Greenland is usually associated with Erik the Red. Erik had been exiled from Iceland. He led a group of settlers westward across the ocean. The exact number of settlers is uncertain. Estimates suggest perhaps a few hundred people initially. They traveled by ship, wooden vessels designed for ocean travel. They carried families, animals, tools, and seeds. The journey was long. The North Atlantic is unpredictable. Ice, storms, and currents made navigation difficult. When they reached Greenland, they explored the coastline. They looked for suitable land. The southwest coast offered the most favorable conditions. Fjords provided shelter from the wind. Some areas had arable land. The sea provided fish and seals. This region became known as the Eastern Settlement. It was the larger of the two main areas of Norse habitation. Another group eventually settled further north. This became the Western Settlement. It was smaller and more dispersed. The Norse selected these locations carefully. They sought areas with milder conditions, places where grass could grow, where animals could graze. They needed access to fresh water. Rivers and streams were essential. Rocky slopes and fjord cliffs provided some protection from the wind. The landscape was challenging. The growing season was short. The soil was thin. Timber was scarce. But there were resources. Driftwood washed up on the shore. Stone could be quarried. Turf and sod could be cut for building. The settlers brought domestic animals with them: cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and horses. These animals were transported by ship, a difficult undertaking, but essential for survival. Cattle and sheep provided milk, meat, and wool. Goats were hardy and could graze on sparse vegetation. Horses were used for transport and labor. Pigs were kept in smaller numbers. The settlers also brought seeds. Barley was the main grain they attempted to cultivate. Other grains were difficult to grow in Greenland's climate. Vegetables were limited. Root crops could sometimes survive, but the growing season was brief. The Norse built their settlements near the coast, close to the fjords, where they could fish and hunt seals. But they also needed land inland, for grazing, for growing hay to feed animals through the winter. The balance between sea and land resources defined their settlement pattern. The Norse built houses suited to the environment. Houses were generally long and narrow. They combined living space with areas for animals. Animals were kept inside during winter. This provided warmth. It also protected the animals from the cold. The layout was practical. Living quarters at one end, animal space at the other, sometimes a central hearth. Construction used local materials: stone for foundations, turf and sod for walls, driftwood for beams and supports. Roofs were covered with turf. This provided insulation. It kept heat inside during the long winters. The buildings were dark inside. Windows were small or absent. Light came from the hearth and from oil lamps. Furniture was simple. Beds were wooden and often raised off the floor. Benches lined the walls. Tables were basic. Hearths provided heat and light. Cooking was done over open fires. Fuel was scarce. Driftwood and animal dung were burned. Clothing was adapted to the climate. Wool from sheep was the primary material. Animal hides were also used. Layers were worn to preserve warmth. Undergarments of wool, outer garments of thicker material, cloaks and hoods for protection from wind. Footwear was made from hides or sealskin. It had to be durable. The ground was often wet or frozen. These garments were functional, not decorative. Survival required warmth above all else. Daily life began early. Families rose with the light. In winter, this meant late mornings. In summer, very early. The first tasks involved tending animals. Cattle and sheep needed feeding. Milking was done daily. Horses were checked. They worked fields when conditions permitted. They also transported goods and people. Goats and pigs required less attention, but they still needed care. Farming was central to life, but the growing season was short, perhaps only a few months. Fields had to be ploughed, barley seeds planted. The soil was thin. It required careful management to prevent erosion. Hay was essential. It fed livestock through the winter. Haymaking consumed much of the summer. Hay was cut by hand, spread to dry, then gathered and stored in barns. The quality and quantity of hay determined how many animals could survive winter. Fishing was a constant activity. The fjords and coastal waters provided cod, halibut, and other species. Hooks and lines were used, small nets, boats were necessary. Boats were constructed from wood or from skin-covered frames. They were designed for fjords and nearshore waters, not for open ocean voyages. Fishing provided protein. It also provided goods that could be preserved or traded. Seals were hunted along the coast. They were found on ice and beaches. Their meat was eaten fresh or dried. Their oil was used for lamps and cooking. Seal hides were used for clothing and boat coverings. Every part of the animal was utilized. Whales were sometimes taken, but this was less common. Whale products were valuable when available. Birds and their eggs were gathered. Some species nested in cliffs near the settlements. Eggs added variety to the diet. Tools were essential. Axes for cutting wood, knives for butchering and general use, sickles for cutting hay. Metal tools were imported. Iron came from Iceland or Europe. It was valuable. It was carefully maintained. Stone, bone, and antler were also used for tools. When metal was unavailable, these materials substituted. Woodworking was necessary for building, for boat repair, for household items. Skill in this craft was passed down through generations. Spinning and weaving were constant tasks. Wool had to be processed, thread spun, cloth woven. This work was done mostly by women, but everyone in the household contributed to some degree. Children participated in work from a young age. They tended small animals, they gathered firewood, they helped in the fields. Skills were learned through observation and practice. Education was informal, focused on survival and craft. Elders contributed experience. They knew the land. They understood weather patterns. They remembered where to hunt and fish. Their knowledge was valuable. It was shared through conversation and example. Christianity had been introduced to Greenland by the Norse settlers. Churches were built, small, simple structures made of stone or turf. They served as gathering points for worship, for community meetings. Clergy were present in some periods. Priests traveled from Iceland or lived in the settlements. Their presence varied over time. Baptisms, marriages, and burials were conducted according to Christian customs. Graves were located near churches, sometimes marked with stones or wooden crosses. Some burials included imported items. This suggests continued connection to the wider Norse world. Religious life was integrated into daily routines. It was not separate from practical work. It provided structure and meaning. Churches were often the largest buildings in a settlement. They represented communal effort. They were maintained over generations. Religious observance also reinforced shared identity. Even isolated farms maintained awareness of Christian practice. Holidays and feast days provided moments of gathering. These events allowed for storytelling, for teaching, for community reinforcement. Social organization reflected Norse traditions. Families owned land. Property was inherited, usually through male lines, though practices could vary. Some individuals held higher status, leaders or elders. Their authority came from experience, knowledge, and family standing. They mediated disputes. They coordinated communal labor. They oversaw shared resources. Assemblies were occasionally held to address matters affecting multiple farms, property boundaries, inheritance, livestock disputes, trade arrangements. Decisions followed customary law. Community enforcement ensured compliance. There were no formal courts. Mutual support was essential. Neighbors assisted each other with labor-intensive tasks, harvesting hay, repairing buildings, managing large animals. This cooperation was necessary for survival. The environment was too harsh for complete independence. Trade connected Greenland to the wider Norse world. The settlements exported goods. Walrus ivory was particularly valuable. It was used in Europe for decorative objects and religious artifacts. Hides and furs were also exported, animal products that were prized in colder regions. In exchange, Greenlanders imported iron, cloth, tools, and occasionally wine or luxury items. Iron was critical. It was needed for tools, nails, and household items. Even small quantities were highly valued. Cloth was another important import. Woolen and linen fabrics came from Iceland and Norway. Clothing was repaired and reused over generations. Trade voyages depended on sea conditions. Ships usually departed during summer, when sea ice had retreated. The journey to Iceland was long. It required favorable weather. Storms, ice, and fog could delay or prevent travel. Contact was therefore irregular. Settlements often went months without seeing a trading vessel. Ship arrivals were anticipated. Goods were carefully rationed until resupply. Ships carried news as well as goods, political developments, weather reports, information from Iceland and Norway. This helped Greenlanders plan. It maintained their connection to European trends and events. Despite distance and isolation, they remained aware of the wider Norse world. The Greenlanders also maintained contact within the island. The eastern and western settlements were connected by overland routes and sea passages. Travel was sometimes hazardous. Weather, snow, and ice made it difficult, but communication allowed coordination of resources. Relatives moved between settlements, for seasonal work, for family reasons. This strengthened cohesion. Shared knowledge of hunting grounds, fishing spots, and pasture land was essential. Hunting and fishing supported trade as well as sustenance. Walrus tusks were carefully harvested, prepared for transport. Cod and other fish could be salted and traded. Hunting was seasonal. Ice and snow influenced when seals could be taken. Boats were prepared for summer travel. Some voyages carried both people and cargo, between settlements or to trading ships. Farmers and hunters managed surplus carefully. Stored hay, dried meat, and salted fish allowed survival through winter. Excess goods were reserved for trade. This required foresight and planning. Social organization influenced trade. Farmsteads operated independently, but coordinated for shipping and resource management. Leaders often oversaw transactions, ensuring fairness and accountability. Documentation was minimal. Records were oral or kept in simple written forms. Churches occasionally noted transactions or ship arrivals. Archaeological evidence confirms these activities. Imported nails, tools, and ornaments have been found. Walrus ivory fragments indicate preparation for export. Weather played a major role. Storms delayed ships. Sea ice blocked routes in winter. Summer was the primary period for trade. Even then, conditions were unpredictable. Settlers developed strategies to manage risk. Goods were stored for extended periods. Food and tools were rationed. Local production was emphasized to reduce dependence on imports. Travel to Iceland or Norway was limited, but not unknown. Individuals occasionally journeyed for extended periods. These trips could be for trade, for family matters, for access to resources not available locally. Travelers brought news, seeds, and tools. They reinforced connections with the Norse world. Life in Greenland was structured by seasons. Summer brought long hours of daylight. This was used for fieldwork, construction, and fishing. Planting happened in late spring or early summer. Barley seeds went into the ground. The brief growing season required careful timing. Hay cutting was a major summer activity. Grass was cut by hand, spread to dry, then gathered and stored. The quality of hay determined livestock survival. Poor hay meant fewer animals could be fed through winter. Summer was also the time for building and repair. Roofs were fixed, walls reinforced, animal pens rebuilt. Boats were maintained, fishing intensified. Fresh fish supplemented the diet. Trade voyages occurred in summer. Ships arrived from Iceland. Goods were exchanged. News was shared. Autumn was a transitional period. Preparation for winter began in earnest. Remaining crops were harvested. Barley was gathered. Vegetables collected. Animals were brought closer to farms. Some were slaughtered for winter meat. The meat was preserved by drying or salting. Food was stored in barrels, in stone containers, in cool areas of houses. Buildings were checked. Any weaknesses were addressed before winter storms arrived. Firewood and fuel were gathered, stockpiled for the months ahead. Winter lasted 8 months in some areas. Days were short. Darkness dominated. Outdoor work was limited. Travel was dangerous. Snow and ice made movement difficult. People stayed indoors. They tended animals kept in the house. They repaired tools. They maintained clothing. Spinning and weaving continued. Household tasks filled the time. Food was rationed. Stored supplies had to last until spring. Livestock required feeding. Hay was distributed carefully. Animals that could not be fed were slaughtered. Winter storms could damage buildings. Snow had to be cleared from roofs. Ice managed around doors and pathways. Isolation increased in winter. Farms could be cut off for weeks. Communities relied on stored knowledge and resources. Spring brought relief. Days lengthened. Snow began to melt. Fields were prepared for planting. Animals were moved to pasture. Fresh grass allowed them to recover from winter. Fishing resumed. Boats went out again. The sea provided fresh protein. Buildings were assessed for winter damage. Repairs began again. This cycle repeated year after year. Each season had its tasks, its rhythms, its necessities. Understanding these patterns was essential. Survival depended on anticipation, on preparation, on experience. Archaeological work in Greenland has revealed much about the Norse settlements. Excavations show longhouses, barns, animal pens, middens filled with refuse. These structures provide evidence of daily life, of construction methods, of resource use. Longhouses followed a typical Norse pattern: long, narrow buildings, divided into sections. Foundations were stone, walls were turf, roofs were turf-covered. Inside, evidence of hearths, of benches along walls, of storage areas. Animal bones found in middens indicate diet: cattle, sheep, goats, seals, fish bones, bird bones. The proportions of these bones show what people ate, how diet changed over time. Early settlements show more cattle bones. Later periods show fewer cattle, more sheep and goats. This suggests adaptation. Larger animals required more resources. Smaller animals were more practical. Tools and artifacts have been recovered: iron knives, axes, nails, sickles. These items were imported. Their presence shows trade connections. Stone tools and bone implements are also common. They supplemented metal when necessary. Spindle whorls indicate textile production. Loom weights show weaving. These artifacts confirm that cloth was made locally, though imported cloth was also used. Imported items include more than tools. Decorative objects have been found: carved bone, ornaments. Some luxury items suggest social hierarchy. Not everyone had equal access to imports. Churches have been excavated: small stone buildings, simple construction. Graves surround them. Burials follow Christian practice. Bodies oriented east-west, some with grave goods. Analysis of bones from graves provides health information: diet, disease, injury patterns. Skeletons show signs of hard labor, arthritis, bone wear, injuries from accidents. Dental health was generally poor. Diet lacked variety. Tooth wear was common. Environmental evidence comes from pollen analysis, seeds, plant remains. These show what crops were grown, what plants were present, how vegetation changed over time. Barley pollen indicates cultivation. Grass pollen shows pasture land. Changes in vegetation suggest climate shifts, cooling temperatures, shorter growing seasons. Driftwood has been analysed. It came from North America, carried by ocean currents. This wood supplemented local resources. It was essential for construction and fuel. Radiocarbon dating provides timelines. It shows when buildings were constructed, when they were abandoned. The Eastern settlement shows occupation from the late 10th century into the 15th century. The Western settlement appears to have been abandoned earlier. perhaps in the 14th century. These timelines help reconstruct settlement history. They show patterns of growth and decline. Excavations continue. New techniques reveal more information. Ground-penetrating radar maps buried structures. Soil analysis shows past land use. Each season of work adds to understanding of how the Norse lived, how they adapted, how they eventually disappeared. The environment imposed constant challenges. The growing season was short. Winter could last 8 months. Snow and ice made travel difficult. Storms damaged houses, washed away crops, threatened livestock. The Norse adapted their practices over time. Houses were insulated carefully. Turf and stone provided protection from cold and wind. Storage for hay and food was expanded to ensure survival through long winters. Fishing and hunting techniques were adjusted to match seasonal availability of resources. Trade with Iceland and Europe provided supplemental goods, but it was irregular. Communities had to be self-sufficient for long periods. Climate records suggest conditions during the Norse period were slightly warmer. This is sometimes called the medieval warm period. Warmer temperatures allowed some farming, made pasture more productive, extended growing seasons slightly. Even so, conditions were marginal. Careful planning was required. Over time, climate appears to have cooled. This is associated with the Little Ice Age. Colder temperatures shortened growing seasons, increased sea ice, made farming more difficult. Archaeological evidence shows changes in response. Later settlements had fewer cattle, more sheep and goats. These animals required less fodder. Buildings became smaller, simpler. This suggests reduced resources. Some structures were repaired rather than replaced. Resources were conserved. Trade became more irregular. Ship arrivals were less frequent. Ice, storms, and longer sea routes made supply uncertain. Imported goods became scarcer. Communities relied more on local production. Metal tools and nails were reused extensively. Clothing and textiles were maintained carefully. Household goods were preserved over generations. Despite these challenges, communities persisted. Farming continued, though on a smaller scale, with hardier crops and animals. Hunting and fishing remained essential. Coastal travel was timed to avoid dangerous ice. Cooperation among neighbors increased. Resources were shared. Labor was pooled. Assemblies addressed disputes. Coordinated responses to environmental stress. Social cohesion helped maintain stability. Religious life continued, though resources for new church construction were limited. Clergy may have visited less frequently, but burials and rituals persisted. Children still learned farming, hunting, and fishing. Skills were passed down, knowledge transmitted. Community routines adapted to scarcity, but they continued. Storytelling, music, and seasonal gatherings persisted, though on a smaller scale. The settlements show remarkable resilience. They endured for centuries, in one of the harshest environments humans have inhabited. But they also show limits. Environmental change, isolation, and resource constraints eventually made survival impossible. By the 14th and 15th centuries, signs of decline were clear. Population had decreased. In both the eastern and western settlements, many farms were abandoned, buildings fell into disrepair, fields were left uncultivated. Ship arrivals became increasingly rare, trade nearly ceased. Without imports, settlements relied almost entirely on local resources. Climate change played a role. The Little Ice Age brought colder temperatures. Growing seasons shortened, winters lengthened, storms increased. This made farming more difficult. Livestock numbers declined. Sea ice expanded, making travel and fishing more hazardous. Environmental stress combined with isolation. Communities could not sustain previous levels of production. Archaeological evidence suggests the Western settlement was abandoned first, perhaps in the mid-14th century. Buildings were left empty or dismantled for materials. Farmsteads shrank. The Eastern settlement persisted longer, into the 15th century, but it too showed decline. Smaller households, fewer animals, reduced construction. The causes of final abandonment are complex: climate, isolation, reduced trade, resource limitations. These factors combined made long-term survival increasingly difficult. There is little evidence of catastrophic events, no sudden disaster, no invasion. Instead, a gradual process of adaptation, of shrinking population, of eventual departure. Some residents may have migrated within Greenland to more favorable locations or back to Iceland. Others may have perished from harsh winters, from reduced food supplies, from isolation. The exact end is unclear. Historical records from Europe mention Greenland less frequently. By the early 16th century, there are no reliable reports of contact. When later explorers arrived, they found ruins, but no living Norse settlements. The settlements had disappeared, leaving only traces. The Norse settlements of Greenland endured for nearly 500 years, from the late 10th century to the 15th century. In one of the world's harshest environments, they established farms, built churches, raised families, maintained trade connections. They adapted to extreme climate, to isolation, to limited resources. Their success depended on careful planning, on seasonal routines, on community cooperation. They managed livestock, crops, and tools with precision. They balanced local resources with imported goods. They transmitted knowledge across generations, teaching children to farm, hunt, and fish. Religious practice provided structure. Community gatherings reinforced cohesion. Despite challenges, they persisted for centuries. But their story also shows limits. Environmental change reduced their capacity to survive. Isolation increased. Trade diminished. Resources became scarce. Adaptation could only go so far. Eventually, the settlements were abandoned. Today, their legacy is preserved in archaeological remains. Longhouses, barns, churches, cemeteries, middens. Stone foundations mark where buildings stood. Turf outlines show house layouts. Animal bones reveal diet. Tools show daily activities. Imported items indicate trade. These artifacts tell a story of practical survival, of community organization, of human resilience. They also provide lessons about adaptation, about resource management, about the balance between environment and survival. The Norse Greenlanders achieved remarkable endurance. They lived at the edge of habitable land. They show that humans can survive in extreme environments, with careful planning, with cooperation, with knowledge. But they also show that survival is not guaranteed. That environmental change can overwhelm even the most adaptive communities. Their settlements are studied today by archaeologists, by historians, by environmental scientists. The evidence is carefully examined, patterns reconstructed, life understood. The Norse of Greenland were not heroes. They were farmers and fishermen, families trying to survive. They worked hard, they adapted, they endured for centuries. Then they were gone, leaving only traces, for us to find, to study, to remember. Their story is not one of conquest, not one of glory. It is a story of daily life, of practical adaptation, of human persistence, and of the limits that even persistence cannot overcome. The land remains, the fjords, the glaciers, the ice. The ruins remain, stone and turf, marking where people once lived. The Norse settlements of Greenland are a chapter in history, a record of survival at the edge, a reminder of both human capability and human limits. Their memory is preserved in the land, in the artifacts, in the careful work of those who study the past, and in accounts like this that tell their story calmly, factually, without drama, because the facts themselves are enough.